أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.
You've shared some really fascinating sources this time. Maybe sort of step back and maybe rethink some, long-held ideas about sacred lands.
Absolutely. I mean, these sources definitely present a challenging perspective, maybe even unconventional, on the whole Promised Land narrative, particularly its history and geography.
Right. So our mission today in this deep dive is really to unpack what these sources are saying, look at their main arguments, the evidence they bring up.
Exactly. And to understand this alternative view they're proposing, it definitely challenges the widely accepted understanding.
Yeah, it seems the core idea, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this common picture of a divine promise, land from the Nile to the Euphrates, the sources say that's maybe only a couple of centuries old?
That's the assertion, yes. They argue it's a much more recent construct than many believe, and they propose a very different geographical reality, one they say is rooted more in the Quran and maybe a rereading of the Torah itself.
A potentially huge shift, then, in how these, foundational stories are understood.
Potentially, yes. The central theme is really about geography, questioning the accepted map, as it were, and suggesting the historical and religious clues point somewhere else entirely. So let's start with this claim about fabrication.
Okay, let's get into that. The sources are pretty blunt, aren't they?
Yeah.
They basically state that this specific idea, the Nile to Euphrates promise in the Torah to Abraham is, they call it a baseless myth when you look closely at the original texts.
They do. And it's not just presented as one possible interpretation. The sources contend this narrative really took hold relatively recently, maybe in the last 200 years or so.
And they link that to, colonial Orientalist narratives.
Yes, that's the term they use. They argue this interpretation was significantly boosted by that kind of scholarship. And perhaps surprisingly, they suggest it was then sort of picked up by some Muslim and Arab scholars too.
Adopted without maybe enough critical look back at the original scriptures.
That seems to be the argument, that it got absorbed into educational systems and wider understanding without that deeper check.
And the language they use is quite striking. I mean, manipulated story, even cursed Israeli promise. It's very strong.
It certainly conveys a very strong conviction. They clearly believe this common understanding isn't just a mistake, but potentially a significant misrepresentation. Which brings us to their next point, the role of translation.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. The sources claim that a key part of this alleged distortion, happened during translation. Specifically, translating texts, they say, were originally Arabic into Hebrew, Greek, Latin.
That's a cornerstone of their argument. It's a very bold claim. They state, quite directly, the original scriptures were in Arabic.
Wow. Okay. So the idea is that meanings got lost, or maybe even deliberately changed in that process.
That's the core of it, yes.
Yeah.
That the nuances, the specific geographical references maybe were altered, leading to what they see as this flawed modern understanding.
And they use Deuteronomy chapter 1 as an example, don't they, to illustrate this point?
They do. They point to the passage where Moses is addressing the Israelites east of the Jordan, that is, in the Araba opposite Suf, between Paran and Tafel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab.
Okay.
The source emphasizes these places. They argue this description clearly puts the Israelites east of the Jordan River in the Araba Valley, which for them contradicts any location near the Nile.
And they provided those two different Arabic translations of that exact English passage from the Torah. What was the purpose of showing those?
Good question. By showing those, they're trying to demonstrate, I think, what they feel is a closer reading, one that aligns better with their proposed geography in Jordan. They argue that even existing Arabic translations might still show signs of that the divergence from what they consider the true Arabic original.
So the argument is basically that translation issues stemming from not recognizing an Arabic original are kind of at the root of the geographical confusion.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The weakness, as they see it, in translating from that supposed Arabic source.
Okay, so moving on from translation. The source then builds its own geographical picture, heavily based on the Quran this time.
Exactly. They offer a specific reinterpretation of Quranic geography. One of the most striking claims is that Egypt of the Quran, Misr, doesn't refer to the modern country of Egypt.
Right, they say it refers to Palestine, west of the Dead Sea.
Precisely. The land west of the Dead Sea. That's a major reframing of a very familiar term.
Okay, that's a significant reinterpretation. What makes them think that compared to, centuries of understanding it as Egypt?
They look at various Quranic verses describing, say, journeys involving Misr. They argue the context of those journeys, the movements described, fits better geographically with moving within historical Palestine, west of the Dead Sea, rather than traveling all the way to the Nile Valley.
And if Egypt is Palestine, west of the Dead Sea, then the Exodus story changes completely too, right?
It has to, yeah. If that's Egypt, then the source argues the Israelites didn't cross from the Nile region. They crossed from that area Palestine west of the Dead Sea over to the Sacred Land, which they locate in Jordan, east of the Dead Sea.
Totally different route.
A completely different map for the Exodus, yes.
And they cite Quranic verses to back this up, this specific Holy Land idea.
They do. They point to Quran 5, verses 21 to 23, where Moses says, "O my people, enter the Holy Land which Allah has assigned to you." The source reads this as a command to enter a specific designated Holy Land, which they argue is clearly located in Jordan, just across the Dead Sea from where they were.
Okay, so this new geography then leads to a re-examination of the Exodus itself, and I guess all the key places mentioned in that story. This seems like another point of major divergence.
It is. So following their logic, Moses led the Israelites across the Dead Sea. They identify the Dead Sea as the Salt Sea of Egypt, the Yam.
The Yam Suf, usually translated as Red Sea or Sea of Reeds. They say that's the Dead Sea.
That's their identification, yes. Crossing from the west side, they're Egypt, Palestine, to the east side, Jordan. This directly contradicts the traditional Exodus narrative.
And they don't just offer this alternative, they actively push back against the Red Sea crossing story.
Very actively. The source calls the traditional Red Sea crossing, whether the Gulf of Suez or Aqaba, a lie and unfounded slander. Very strong language again, showing a complete rejection of the mainstream view. You have to wonder what specific textual analysis leads them to be so certain.
So if the crossing was different, the places they visited afterwards must be different too. You mentioned they offer corrected locations based on modern maps of Jordan and Palestine. Can you give us some examples? It helps to visualize this radical remapping.
Sure. It's quite a list. They identify Mount Horeb, or Harun's mountain, not in Sinai, but as Jabal Harun, near Petra in Jordan.
Okay, Horeb and Petra. Got it.
The Araba is identified as Wadi Rabba, the valley south of the Dead Sea, again in Jordan. Paran is linked to Wadi Rum, famous desert area in southern Jordan.
Wadi Rum, okay.
Tafa is equated with modern Tafileh, Jordan, south of Amman. Kadesh Barnea, a really crucial site in the wanderings.
Yeah. Where do they place that?
They equate Kadesh Barnea with Petra itself.
Petra again. Wow. Okay.
Suf is identified as Gor al-Safi, down at the southeastern tip of the Dead Sea. Laban becomes Wadi Laban. Hazeroth is interpreted as the Plateau of Wandering in southern Jordan. Dizahab is placed near Dibon, east of the Dead Sea.
Dibon, okay.
And the Seir Mountains are identified as Jabal al-Sir, which is described as the range running south from the Dead Sea towards Kaaba. So you see, it consistently pulls the geography east of the Jordan Rift Valley.
It's a comprehensive relocation, almost entirely into Jordan. You said Tafel was particularly interesting to the source. Why was that?
Yeah, they make an interesting, though perhaps linguistically debatable, connection. They link the name Tafel, phonetically, to the Hebrew word tefillin, those prayer boxes.
Right.
And based on this phonetic link, they interpret Tafel negatively as a house of evil, possibly linked to idolatry in their narrative.
In Petra, Al-Batra.
Yeah.
You said they identify it as Kadesh Barnea, but also something even more significant.
Yes, this is probably their most radical claim. They assert that Petra was the original Mecca.
The original Mecca, not the one in Saudi Arabia.
Correct. They claim the current Mecca in the Hijaz is a later fabrication, established centuries after the fact. Their argument seems based on interpreting early texts and geographical descriptions which they believe fit Petra far better than the Hijazi location.
That directly contradicts centuries of Islamic tradition and history. What's their basis for such a monumental claim?
It appears to rely heavily on their rereading of geographical markers in the earliest sources, arguing these point towards Petra, and that the shift to the Hijaz was a later, perhaps politically motivated development. It's definitely a fringe view, but central to their thesis.
Okay. And what about the phrase, a land without vegetation? Where does that fit in?
They interpret that phrase, from the Quran, as referring specifically to Wadi Araba, that arid valley south of the Dead Sea. They connect this description to warnings, as they see them, against the later fabrication of holy sites like Jerusalem and especially the current Mecca in the Hijaz, suggesting those sites don't fit the description of the original Holy Valley.
And places like Dibon or Dizahab, what role do they play?
According to the source, locations like Dibon mark points along the Israelites' journey within this revised geography, mainly in Jordan, east of the Dead Sea. They help trace the path of the narrative in this specific region.
You also mentioned the Dead Sea and Jordan River getting a specific Quranic reference.
Yes, they interpret Quran 55, verses 19-20, often translated as He released the two seas, as referring to the Dead Sea, saltwater, and the Jordan River, freshwater, noting the barrier mentioned in the verse aligns with the hydrological reality there.
Interesting. And Suf, al-Safi, you said, was tied to the boundaries of this sacred land.
That's right. They place Sufgor al-Safi within the boundaries of the sacred land in Jordan, and they make another connection, linking it to al-Safa, one of the mounds central to the Hajj rituals in Mecca.
Suggesting the original Safa was there, near the Dead Sea.
That seems to be the implication, yes. That the name and significance were transferred later to the Hijazi Mecca, obscuring the original Jordanian location, in their view.
Okay, and Faran.
Faran. They connect to the Khazna al-Firon, the famous treasury building carved into the rock at Petra.
The treasury of the pharaoh, linking it directly to the Exodus story and Egypt.
Exactly, tying that iconic Petra landmark into their version of the biblical narrative.
And Hazeroth, the plateau of wandering. Tell us more about that.
They interpret Hazeroth, the Shulani way, as this specific area of exile in southern Jordan. This is where, according to the source's reading, the Israelites were condemned to wander for 40 years because they broke their covenant after leaving the initial sacred land.
Right, which leads us to the covenant itself. And then finally, the Seir Mountains you mentioned, a translation issue there too.
Yes, with the Seir Mountains. Okay. The source claims that translations deliberately distorted the location to make it fit somewhere in the Hijaz desert, near the current Mecca.
But they argue the original texts are clear.
They argue the original Arabic, Hebrew, and even English versions clearly point to the mountain range running south from the Dead Sea to Aqaba, making the Hijaz location impossible, and suggesting, again, deliberate alteration to fit the fabricated Mecca narrative.
So this brings us back to the covenant. How does the source understand that agreement?
They reference the Quran, chapter 5, verses 12-13, outlining the covenant made with the children of Israel. Key to their understanding is that it was conditional. Residency in the sacred land depended on maintaining faith and doing justice.
Not an automatic unconditional promise, then?
No, explicitly conditional according to this interpretation.
And the consequence for breaking it?
Is spelled out, they say, in Quran 5, verse 26. For 40 years they shall wander in the land. This, for the source, explains the wandering in the deserts of Jordan, a direct result of failing to uphold their end of the deal.
Okay. And all of this, the geography, the translation issues, the broken covenant, it culminates in what the source calls the great betrayal of history. That sounds significant.
It's the summary of their entire argument, really. They repeat the accusation that over centuries, different groups they name Israelite priests, Arab agents, colonialists worked, maybe consciously or unconsciously, to divert attention away from Jordan.
Away from Jordan and towards Egypt's Nile and the Hijaz.
Precisely. A systematic misdirection, as they see it, obscuring the true locations.
And this alleged betrayal includes the holiest site in Islam.
Yes, they double down on the claim. The modern Mecca in Hijaz is, in their view, a fabrication. It's positioned far from what they identify as the original Qibla of light, namely Petra.
And they connect this to a Quranic warning.
They do. They quote Quran 5, verse 13 again. They distort the words from their proper usages and have forgotten a portion of that of which they were reminded. They see this verse as directly relevant, a divine warning about exactly this kind of alleged distortion of scripture and geography.
Wow. Okay. This has definitely been a deep dive, exploring a perspective that really challenges some very fundamental, widely held beliefs. So for you, the listener, let's try to summarize the core takeaways here.
Well, I think the main thing is you've heard a viewpoint that radically questions the standard Nile to Euphrates promised land narrative. It grounds itself in a very different reading of both the Quran and parts of the Torah.
And it proposes a completely different map, essentially,
Yeah.
centered on Jordan, east of the Dead Sea, right?
Exactly. Re-identifying key biblical sites like Horeb, Kadesh Barnea, maybe even the original Mecca, placing them in Jordan, not Sinai or Palestine or the Hijaz.
And running through it all is this strong claim of, well, what the source calls deliberate deception over centuries, a kind of historical cover-up.
Yes, and a call to re-examine these very familiar stories, these texts, with completely fresh eyes, using this alternative geographical lens to, as they put it, rediscover the light.
It really leaves you with a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It forces you, the listener, to consider how these foundational narratives are formed and passed down.
And it poses that provocative question, what if the mental map we have for these incredibly significant events and holy places, what if it's fundamentally different from the map intended by the original texts, according to this interpretation?
Yeah. What would the implications be if the geography of these sacred stories was so drastically different from what's commonly accepted today? It's certainly a challenge to convention and maybe an invitation for you to explore these complex histories and texts further on your own.
أنا دكتور خالد وليد ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.